Hey, I'm Mike Gilliam, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. For nearly 2 years, the labor market has been red hot, but that may be changing. Take a look behind the headlines, and you'll see that while unemployment rates are low at about 3.7%, they're higher here in New York, and even higher for minorities. According to the city comptroller, Brad Lander, the unemployment rate in New York City is now about 5.6%, but for blacks, it's 9.4%, getting closer to 3 times the national average. If you look at numbers for young people in New York State and the city, the statistics are even more troubling. According to figures from the state comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, unemployment among 16 to 24-year-olds stands at almost 18% in the city. The economy hasn't completely rebounded from the pandemic yet, but it's slowing down, and a lot of that can be attributed to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates to curb inflation. Layoffs may be coming in many sectors and have already started at tech companies and at businesses like Peloton. Companies are choosing not to replace workers when they leave. Others have instituted hiring freezes. And according to Forbes, the Fed see the unemployment rate increasing to 4.4% this year, which would mean almost 1.5 million workers would lose their jobs. When the economy tightens and jobs are lost, it often hits minority communities first and hardest. How do we fix it? Here to help us delve into the topic, we have 2 guests. The director of the Black Male Initiative Program at Kingsborough Community College, Mike Rodriguez, and the CEO of the Community Service Society, David Jones. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome to both of you. David, let's start with you. How bad is the situation for African American men in New York City? And I know a lot of them actually are not counted because of the way these figures are dealt with.
And we're concerned with that too, particularly for that demographic 16 to 24, because they're facing just an avalanche of problems. The 2 years of COVID, they were in school. Many of them lost more than 2 years of finishing the degree for high school or, and so they're really disadvantaged in this whole thing. Can they connect with the world of work? They don't have the networks to do it. And so that's the demographic that has all sorts of implications for the city and for the entire community. We also see it, and we somewhat disagree with some people, that that's a dangerous drive towards more criminal activity in poor neighborhoods.
Because people don't have options?
You don't have options. It doesn't mean every kid who's out of work or every young person who's out of work turns to crime. But even if you get a fraction of that, of somebody who has no sources of income, no educational background to get into the economy, that's an invitation for disaster. You don't police that. We have to cut jobs programs. I mean, the Great Depression, they understood that.
Right.
And that's what we're going to have to need in this whole city. We're going to have.
Let me ask you this though: How deep do you think the problem is? I mean, like we hear numbers like 18%, 24%. Do you think it's much worse than that?
I think it is much worse than that, and I don't think it's even I grew up in Crown Heights. You look at parts of the Bronx. I know it's higher than that, where young people are just not finding any way to connect with the world of work.
Mike, why do you think African American men are hit so hard?
Well, I think there's some historical issues. I mean, racism definitely plays a factor, especially institutional racism. Historically, black men have always had the highest unemployment rates. So ultimately, that trickles down to today. I think young people today, there's a shifting happening in what they mean, what work means. If you look at the rise in social media, Instagram, TikTok, young people today are witnessing whole new vocations happening through social media. So when we say let's create jobs for young people, we have to really consider what does it mean to work for a 16 to a 24-year-old? What does that really mean today? And it's different from what somebody from my generation thinks work is.
David, your organization published the results of what you called the Unheard Thirds survey. Talk to us a little bit about that and kind of frame for us like where we really are.
So about a decade ago, we decided to start doing polling of low-income communities in the city of New York, and it's the largest poll in the nation now. It's been going on for more than a decade, and basically each summer we have a battery in the last 28 minutes of questions that we use cell phones and regular phones, more tilting towards cell phones, to find out what's happening among poor communities, what they need, and starting to prioritize what this is about. And things that come out are, you should expect it. Housing crisis, jobs crisis, crime. But we also found other things. For instance, we started one of our major initiatives that led to something called Fair Fares, the half-price fare program in MTA now, which we spearheaded. And that came out of the survey where people, about a quarter of the people said, I can't afford the subways anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm a community college student. I have to do a part-time job. Suddenly, what seems like modest amounts of money, $2.75 a ride, suddenly you're talking about every day you have to come up with $10. It essentially makes it impossible. Mm-hmm. So Fair Fares, if you're below poverty, you get a half-price fare. But even that's not enough. We recognize that the poverty standard that is applied in New York City is $23,000 for a family of 3. It's based the same as Mississippi. Mm-hmm. The costs of housing are so enormous in New York that actually you have to go to 200% of poverty even to come near what it actually costs to live in the city of New York. So we started to use this. I was concerned, having grown up a long time ago in Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy, how do you find out what people are actually thinking of and what they think they need? Not what I think they needed in the 1960s, but what they need now. And that's why you started to elicit a whole range of things that people need to know if we're going to effectively help poor communities. Mm-hmm. It also led to our understanding of the high number of young men, particularly, who have criminal records and are basically barred from any employment. No matter what people say, oh, it doesn't matter, you're not allowed to check. If you have a criminal record, even for, because of the drug epidemic and the Rockefeller drug laws, 20 years later, you're still barred from many aspects of employment.
Let me ask you, Mike, how is all of that and the fact that you have so much poverty and low wages within the African-American community, and especially for African-American males, how is that affecting the communities, and how is that affecting people as they try to go about improving their lives and having decent lives?
Well, what it does is it creates an unrealistic challenge, right? Like David mentioned, living in New York City is one of the most expensive cities in the world. So for a young person who is 18, 19, 20, and they're coming to their own, especially a young black male, there's some cultural things I think we need to kind of really take a look at, because culturally, as a young man, I now cannot be a burden on my family. When I was 13, 14, 15, I could ask for a Metro card or ask for money for. Now, coming into my manhood, and which is supported by many of our communities culturally, I can no longer be a burden. So therefore, I now have to find ways to make money. And sometimes college at one point is a really good example and a way to make money. But for a 19-year-old or 18-year-old young man who has a choice between going to school and college and then working will win out every time. But the reality is, for a young man who is underserved, who is undereducated, ultimately is underskilled. And now they try to get a job, and it's a minimum wage, low-paying job to where they can only basically take care of themselves, if that. So it doesn't really solve the problem.
Okay. David, I want to see if we can come up with some fixes here, some concrete solutions to all of this. And I know that they've created more summer jobs. That helps.
I think that's one of the things. The Summer Youth Employment Program, I used to be Youth Service Commissioner of the City of New York. It still leaves tens of thousands of young people out. It's a lottery system. It should be universal. That's the first thing.
You want a job,
and
you
we're
get a
very
job.
close. We're very close to it. I think Mayor Adams has already expanded the program. I think given the economy, we have to make it accessible to anybody who wants it. No lottery, you got it. We have to then link that program to the school. For instance, you start out, you think you have an idea of a career, starting to match what the young person is interested in with the availability of potential summer jobs and having them progress. There's a great model for this that was up in Boston called Project Protec. It was done by a group called Jobs for the Future, which essentially young people who are interested in the medical field got a sort of first a mentoring experience going into labs in the various hospitals. If they did well at school, that next year they'd actually get an appointment that actually you got to handle things.
Oh, that's
By the end of it, the graduation rate was incredible, and the immediate promise not only of a summer youth employment job, but an after-school job, which has to be the next step here.
Talk to me a little bit about the Black Male Initiative. What is it?
Well, the Black Male Initiative is a program across every CUNY campus. There's 30 programs, and what it is, it's designed to support underrepresented students. So we do that through a series of social emotional workshops and mentoring. Every single BMI program has a mentoring component. So what we do is we work with students. Now, the programs range from GED, HSE programs, all the way through undergrad to graduate programs, where we support underrepresented students to really give them the social emotional tools as well as the mentorship they need to succeed and get through and graduate.
I want to thank our guests, the director of the BMI program at Kingsborough Community College, Mike Rodriguez, and the CEO of the Community Service Society, David Jones. Thank you both for coming on.
My pleasure.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at the return home of WNBA star Brittney Griner and what it means, and also how that all fits into where we now stand on cannabis legalization, not just at the local level, but at the state and federal levels. I'm Mike Gilliam. This is Let It Rip. Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. WNBA star Brittney Griner is back home on U.S. soil. It took nearly 10 months to win her release in a prisoner swap. Griner, a two-time Olympic gold medalist and player for the Phoenix Mercury, was held in Russia on drug charges after being arrested last February at a Russian airport. She was accused of smuggling hash oil into the country in her luggage. Griner was traveling to Russia to play basketball for a Russian team during the WNBA offseason. She was found guilty in August and sentenced to 9 years in a penal colony. Her wife kept public pressure on the Biden administration, and eventually she was freed in a prisoner swap for a convicted arms dealer, Victor Bout, known as the Merchant of Death, convicted of selling arms to be used to kill Americans. It was widely believed that Russian President Vladimir Putin was using Griner as leverage against the U.S. in the wake of harsh sanctions imposed after Russia invaded Ukraine a week after her arrest. While most applaud the release, there's been backlash, especially on the political right. There are complaints that corporate security executive Paul Whelan, a former Marine jailed on espionage charges since 2018, was not freed with Griner because the Russians would not go along with his release. Let's talk about the swap and problems with cannabis laws. We have two guests, a professor of sociology at York College and the daughter of activist and comedian Dick Gregory, Michele Gregory, and the York College Athletics and Inclusion Designee, Ebonie Jackson. Welcome to both of you. Michele, let's start with you. Brittney Griner's release was something good, but there was a heavy backlash. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, yes, one cannot overstate the importance of her release, certainly, and especially, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine and having Americans over there, with the U.S., of course, supporting Ukraine, but also as a Black gay woman in a country that is very anti-LGBTQ, certainly. So that bringing her home was certainly critical. And yes, someone like Vladimir Putin knows he has that kind of leverage. It's like, if on one side you care somewhat about human rights, on the other side you don't, of course the side who doesn't care has more leverage if you want to bring Americans back home, okay, in this environment. The attacks, I mean, it's interesting, kind of looking what former President Trump tweeted over the weekend, first that, why wasn't Paul Whelan brought back? And then in another tweet admitted, well, he had the opportunity, okay, to bring him back, but declined to, because obviously Paul Whelan was detained during the Trump presidency, certainly. And so there's a, kind of a lack of sincerity about, if you had cared enough about Paul Whelan, you certainly could have, okay, brought him back. And then Donald Trump Jr. had tweeted something about Brittney Griner being a DEI, initiative, diversity, equity, and inclusion, certainly. Well, again, notwithstanding, your father could have already had Paul Whelan back, okay? So the issue is, you're angry about who was brought back.
Right.
Somebody who you don't like her politics, you don't think she is sufficiently patriotic.
And there was a chance to take a stab at the current administration, too.
Absolutely.
Ebonie, what was your reaction?
Well, I mean, the reaction was, of course, relief and tremendous gratitude. It had been, as you said, more than 10 months. And I'm just grateful that her wife, her teammates, the sports world in general, continued to keep the pressure on this administration, but on everyone, to not forget her, to not let her languish, and to not forget this case. And so I think this is a true testament of real allyship and advocacy within the sports world, but also within our greater community. And I know the reactions have been joyous and swift when it was announced that she was finally being brought home.
A lot of athletes spoke out on her behalf. What was your reaction to the fact that it kind of unified the sports world?
Well, I think that Dawn Staley, who coached her in the Olympics, said it best. The sports world is a very small community. It really is. It's a lot of people, but it's a small community. And I think that, activism and social justice within athletics has been going on for a lot of time. And I'm happy that they all rallied around her. And it wasn't just her female teammates from her team or her female teammates from the U.S. Olympics team, but it was also NBA stars like Steph Curry, who made sure to rally around her and to keep her name relevant throughout all of the many sports events that we've had in the past 10 months. She was never far out of mind, and I thought that was really key.
Yeah, because this was horrible as it was, but it could have been even worse had she been forced to stay there for the entire sentence.
Absolutely.
9 years. This is crazy. I found it particularly troubling, too, that she was going through all of this over something that's basically legal in half of the United States at this point. What do you think about that aspect of it?
Well, I think that, per Dr. Gregory, it really wasn't about the cannabis oil.
Right.
It just wasn't. And although Russia has had a strict policy against drugs, it happens when it suits them. And so I think that, especially as you mentioned, cannabis is being legalized not just in the United States, but globally in many, many different places. I think that we need to not get bogged down in that aspect, because as Dr. Gregory said, Paul Whelan could have been brought home. The invasion of Ukraine happened 6 days after she was detained. So there's so many other factors. And with the legalization and the decriminalization of cannabis, I'm just not sure why that was even an issue. She had less than an ounce of oil on her when she was detained, and it's mind-boggling.
I know, but Michele, I want to talk a little bit about the draconian laws, though, in some states here. There's a gentleman in Mississippi who's serving like life for possession at this point. And they, of course, have linked that to other cases that he was involved in, but still, life for possession, that's pretty heavy. What do you think about the fact that we have that going on in this country right now? What do you think needs to be done?
Well, I mean, so much of, if you think back, going back to the 1700s in this country and the slave patrols, that was the first, the beginning of what, hundreds of years later become, police force, and it was to, of course, catch runaway slaves. So this framing of, in terms of folks who have, committed infractions, a lot of it is rooted in race in this country. And so if we fast forward, certainly in the last 30, 40 years, the war on drugs, I mean, of course it was when I say of course, I mean, those who were most affected by it were those in the Black and brown communities. And again, this is really important. These were especially non-violent offenses. Okay, so this, targeting, this making of a boogeyman, okay, of folks who are, yes, drug issues are very, very disconcerting, certainly, but it's sort of always easier to frame it when the villain doesn't look like you.
So what do you make of John Boehner now getting involved in the business?
Well, it's economic, I mean, reasons too. I mean, it's never a problem, right? In some ways, something that you vehemently were against. And then on the other hand, sometimes don't have a problem. It's not as bad, okay, when you can see the economic potential, the benefits of that. And, if we think about, right, the attacks, in terms of Brittney Griner, what she was charged with in Russia, and there was far less attention, right, in April on the release of Trevor Reed, the former Marine, for the Russian Konstantin Yeroshenko. He was convicted in the U.S. of smuggling in $100 million worth of cocaine, okay? And so, of course, those exchanges are made, especially, again, when you have one country that is happy to leverage that, in this case, Putin administration, but, that's kind of glaring, the lack of, I don't think anybody should be attacked, but the fact is that was also a huge swap. And when you think about, quote, the danger that Yeroshenko posed to the U.S.
Yeah. Ebonie, I wanted to ask you another question that kind of deals with the sports end of this. The use of cannabis by athletes. Do you think that's going to be lessened because of this, or do you think it will increase? What are you seeing out there right now?
Well, I think that, cannabis use by athletes will follow the national trends. And it's important to note that Brittney Griner had a prescription, right, from a U.S. doctor to utilize the cannabis oil for pain.
Right.
You have to realize that these athletes, their bodies take a tremendous pounding.
Oh yeah, up and down the hardwood like that your entire life?
Absolutely. And so, managing pain with cannabis is not just for athletes, but for others as well. And so I do think that, I certainly know that, no WNBA stars will be going over to Russia to play in their offseason anytime
I'll
soon.
say Turkey. I'm all out of time. That's going to have to be the last word. Good discussion, though, on topics that need to be addressed. I'm glad she's home, and I want to thank our guest, sociology professor at York College and the daughter of activist and comedian Dick Gregory, Michele Gregory, and York College athletics inclusion designee Ebonie Jackson. Thank you both. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll celebrate Dr. King's work, especially around improving working conditions for people of color and why he was in Memphis when he was assassinated. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. Now for some final thoughts. We want to take this opportunity to remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and celebrate the King holiday by taking a look back at the civil rights icon and some of his work. King was in Memphis continuing his civil rights work, which had expanded to include advocating for workers' rights and economic justice by supporting the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. He was asked to come to the Tennessee city to give a spark to the striking workers and their supporters. The strike began on February 12, 1968, with 1,300 black sanitation workers demanding better working conditions and higher pay. At the time, conditions were horrible. the workers were paid a paltry 65 cents an hour, making many of them eligible for welfare and food stamps, even though they were working for the city. They were not allowed to shower inside their building, even though the job was filthy, and many complained of maggots in their clothing following a shift of loading and unloading garbage. They worked long hours, often in the rain, and got no overtime pay. The strike started a couple of weeks after two of the workers sought shelter from the rain in the back of their garbage truck, where they were crushed to death by a faulty compactor. The city refused to pay any compensation or death benefits to the victims' families. It was that tragedy and the strike that drew Dr. King to Memphis, which became the stage for his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech and his assassination. It happened on April 4th, 1968, on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel. King was working on his anti-poverty initiatives at the time, including the building of the Poor People's Campaign, advocating for the underprivileged. So it's appropriate to remember him and his legacy, and to keep sight of the fact that in 2023, we're still fighting for black men to get economic justice, fighting to be able to find good-paying jobs and support families, and to be able to build generational wealth that can be passed down. So this January and every January, we remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we celebrate his work and his life. I'm Mike Gilliam. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Let It Rip.